Theseus. Aegeus, king of Athens, being twice married and having no children, was so desirous of an heir to his throne that he made a pilgrimage to Delphi in order to consult the oracle. But the response being ambiguous, he repaired to Troizina to consult his wise friend Pitthea, who reigned over that city, by whose advice he contracted a secret marriage with his friend's daughter Aithra. After passing some time with his bride, Aegeus prepared to take his departure for his own dominions, but before doing so he led Aithra to the seashore, where, after depositing his sword and sandals under a huge rock, he thus addressed her: "Should the gods bless our union with a son, do not reveal to him the name and rank of his father until he is old enough to possess the strength requisite for moving this stone. Then send him to my palace at Athens, bearing these tokens of his identity." A son was born to Aithra, whom she called Theseus, and who was carefully trained and educated by his grandfather Pitthea. When he had developed into a strong and manly youth, his mother conducted him to the spot where the rock had been placed by Aegeus, and at her command he rolled away the stone, and took possession of the sword and sandals which had lain there for 16 years, and which she now desired him to convey to his father, Aegeus, king of Athens. His mother and grandfather were anxious that the youth should travel by the safe sea route, the road between Troizina and Athens being at this time infested with robbers of a great ferocity and enormous strength. But, feeling within himself the spirit of a hero, Theseus resolved to emulate the deeds of Heracles, with whose fame all Greece resounded, and therefore chose the more dangerous journey by land as calculated to afford him an opportunity of distinguishing himself by feats of valour. His first adventure occurred at Epidaurus, where he met Periphetes, a son of Hephaestus, who was armed with an iron club with which he killed all travellers. Having received from his grandfather a full description of this savage, Theseus at once recognized him, and rushing upon him with his sword succeeded, after a desperate encounter, in killing him. He appropriated the club as a trophy of his victory, and proceeded on his journey without hindrance until he arrived at the Isthmus of Corinth. Here the people warned him to beware of Sinis the robber, who forced all travellers to bend with him one of the branches of a tall pine tree. Having dragged it to the ground, the cruel Sinis suddenly released his hold, whereupon the bough, rebounding high up into the air, the unfortunate victim was dashed to the ground and killed. When Theseus beheld Sinis advancing towards him, he steadily awaited his approach. Then, seizing his powerful club, he killed the inhuman wretch with one blow. Passing through the woody district of Crommyon, Theseus next slew a wild and dangerous sow which had long ravaged the country. He then continued his journey and approached the borders of Megara, where, on a narrow path overhanging the sea, dwelt the wicked Sciron, another terror to travellers. It was his custom to compel all strangers who passed his abode to wash his feet, during which operation he kicked them over the rock into the sea. Theseus boldly attacked the giant, overcame him, and then flung his body over the cliff where so many of his victims had perished. Theseus now journeyed on to Eleusis, where he found another adversary in the person of King Cercyon, who forced all comers to wrestle with him, and killed those whom he vanquished. But Theseus overcame the mighty wrestler, and slew him. Near Eleusis, on the banks of the river Cephissus, Theseus met with a new adventure. Here lived the giant Damastes, called Procrustes, or the Stretcher, who had 2 iron beds, one being long and the other short, into which he forced all strangers. In the short one he placed the tall men, whose limbs he cut to the size of the bed, whilst to the short ones he assigned the large bed, stretching them out to fit it. And thus he left his victims to expire in the most cruel torments. Theseus freed the country from this inhuman monster by serving him as he had done his unfortunate victims. The hero now continued his journey, and at length reached Athens without meeting with any further adventures. When he had arrived at his destination, he found his father a helpless tool in the hands of the sorceress Medea, whom he had married after her departure from Corinth. Knowing by means of her supernatural powers that Theseus was the king's son, and fearing that her influence might be weakened by his presence, she poisoned the mind of the old king against the stranger, whom she represented as being a spy. It was accordingly arranged that Theseus should be invited to a banquet, and a strong poison mixed with his wine. Now Theseus had resolved to reveal himself at this feast to the father whom he yearned to embrace. Before tasting the wine, he put his plan into execution, and drew out his sword, so that the eyes of the king might rest upon it. When Aegeus beheld once more the well-known weapon which he had so often wielded, he knew that it was his son who stood before him. He warmly embraced him, presented him as his heir to his courtiers and subjects, and then, no longer able to endure the sight of Medea, he banished her forever from his dominions. When Theseus was acknowledged as the rightful heir to the throne, he was opposed by the 50 sons of Pallas, the king's brother, who had confidently expected that on the demise of the old king the government of the country would devolve upon them. They therefore resolved to put Theseus to death, but their plans becoming known to him, he surprised them as they lay in ambush awaiting his approach, and destroyed them all. Fearing, however, lest the Athenians might entertain a prejudice against him on account of his extermination of their fellow citizens, the Pallantids, Theseus resolved to perform some signal service for the state which should gain for him the hearts of the people. He accordingly decided to rid the country of the famous bull of Marathon, which had become a terror to the cultivators of the land. He captured the animal and brought him in chains to Athens, where, after publicly exhibiting him to the astonished multitude, he solemnly sacrificed him to Apollo. The next enterprise undertaken by Theseus far surpassed all his other feats of heroic daring, and secured to him the universal admiration and gratitude of his fellow citizens. This was the slaying of the Minotaur, which put an end for ever to the shameful tribute of 7 youths and 7 maidens, which was exacted from the Athenians every 9 years. The origin of this barbarous tribute was as follows. Androgeos, the youthful son of Minos, king of Crete, having been treacherously murdered by the Athenians, his father, anxious to avenge the death of his son, declared war against their king Aegeus, and conquered Athens and the villages in its vicinity. The conqueror henceforth compelled the Athenians to send to him every 9 years a tribute of 7 youths and 7 maidens of the noblest families in the land, who became the prey of the Minotaur, a monster half man, half bull, whose lair was in the wonderful labyrinth constructed by Daedalus for the Cretan king. When Theseus informed his father of his heroic determination, he was overwhelmed with grief and endeavoured by every means in his power to shake his son's resolution, but, confident of success, Theseus assured his father that he would slay the Minotaur and return home victorious. It was customary for the vessel bearing its unhappy freight of human victims to use on this voyage black sails only, but Theseus promised his father that, should he return in safety, he would hoist white ones in their place. Before leaving Athens, Theseus, by the advice of an oracle, chose Aphrodite as his guardian and protectress, and accordingly offered up a sacrifice to her. When he arrived in the presence of King Minos, the goddess of love inspired Ariadne, the beautiful daughter of the king, with an ardent attachment for the noble young hero. During a secret interview, in which a mutual confession of affection took place, Ariadne furnished him with a sharp sword and a clue of thread, the end of which she desired him to fasten at the entrance to the labyrinth, and to continue to unwind it till he reached the lair of the Minotaur. Full of hope as to the successful issue of his undertaking, Theseus took leave of the kind maiden after expressing his gratitude for her timely aid. At the head of his companions he was now conducted by Minos to the entrance of the labyrinth. Strictly adhering to the injunctions of the fair Ariadne, he succeeded in finding the Minotaur, whom, after a fierce and violent struggle, he defeated and killed. Then, carefully feeling his way by means of the clue of thread, he led his companions safely out of the labyrinth. They then fled to their ship, taking with them the lovely maiden to whose affection for their deliverer they owed their safety. Arrived at the island of Naxos, Theseus had a dream in which Dionysus, the wine god, appeared to him and informed him that the fates had decreed that Ariadne should be his bride,